The universal right to vote was the culmination of hundreds of years of small and large steps that resulted in a political culture where everyone, regardless of class, wealth, or gender, was able to vote. Our first guest tonight is Francis Fukuyama, Senior Fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies at Stanford University. He's recently published the second volume of his opus on the history of political order. It's called Political Order and Political Decay. And we welcome Francis Fukuyama back to TVO. Professor, it's good to see you again. How are you doing tonight?
Very good. Thanks very much for having me.
I don't want to spoil the ending of your 548-page opus here, but let's just say it doesn't end on a very happy note. And let's start there. How do the forces, in your view, of decay in liberal democracies these days manifest themselves?
Well, I think that decay is really a matter of two things. It's intellectual rigidity that doesn't allow you to adapt institutions when circumstances change. And then it's also the capture of the state by interest groups. The state is, a modern state is supposed to be impersonal, but there's a tendency over time for powerful elites to use their influence to manipulate the state. And I don't think this is a feature just of democracies. I think virtually every political order that's existed in history over time has been subject to this. And I think you can see some signs of this happening in the contemporary United States with the rise of very powerful interest groups representing forces, for example, like the banking industry, that have really blocked, I think, beneficial public policies because they can't be dislodged in terms of their political power.
To that end, let me read the following excerpt from your book and share it with our viewers. If there has been a single problem facing contemporary democracies, either aspiring or well-established, it has been centered in their failure to provide the substance of what people want from government: personal security, shared economic growth, and quality basic public services like education, health, and infrastructure that are needed to achieve individual opportunity. So just to be clear about this, safety, health care, a good education system, but not freedom?
Well, I think we take freedom for granted. A government, a modern political system, in my view, has to have really three institutions. It needs a state, which is really about power, which is the ability to actually provide those kinds of services and security and so forth. But that power needs to be constrained by two other institutions, one of which is the rule of law, and the other of which is democratic accountability. And so I think that an important, a just system and a well-functioning system is really a balance of forces that are not necessarily compatible or fully in harmony with one another. So if you have too much state and not enough law and democratic accountability, you get a dictatorship. And if you have too much constraint and not enough state, you get a state that doesn't provide those basic services that people want out of government. And so you really need to be somewhere in the middle.
And where is that balance in the United States of America today, in your view?
Well, I think that historically the American system came out of a revolt against British monarchical power, and we've always emphasized law and democracy, the institutions of constraint over a state. In fact, the first effort to create the United States was the Articles of Confederation that created such a weak body that we had to have a constitutional convention that provided the kind of executive authority that exists in the United States now. But our political culture is really on the constraint side. We want freedom, and I think despite a lot of Republicans worrying about Obama being a dictator, we live in probably one of the freest societies in human history. But on the state side, I think there have been a number of failings. Congress hasn't been able to pass budgets because of polarization and deadlock. Services work much better than in a developing country, but they could work much, much better than they do. And I think that's what is bothering Americans. Plus, this feeling that you see among the populist, certain populist voices, that there are a lot of shadowy elites that are out there manipulating the system to their own benefit. And I think that down the road is not healthy for the legitimacy of the system.
Okay, I just want to make sure I understand the emphasis, though, because, of course, from north of the border, we see an America in Canada that is heavily focused on freedom, and then whatever, security and well-being and so on, that comes later. Are you saying that it's the other way around right now, that actually...
No, you got it. You've got it exactly right. One of my dear mentors, Seymour Martin Lipset, that wrote extensively on Canada, said that that's exactly the difference between Canada and the United States, that Canada has much more respect for the state, much more respect for order. It cares about law and democracy as well, but it gets them in much more of a balance, whereas the United States has always de-emphasized the executive branch and state authority and built up the institutions of constraint, law and democracy. And I think that explains the difference between the two societies completely.
Let's go back a bit to first principles here. And again, I want to return to that three-legged stool you talked about, the state, the law, and democratic accountability. I suppose we in the West, in Western democracies, like to think that we have, in spite of the criticisms that you have in your most recent book, that we have the best way of organizing society and living in the world. Do you think that it was inevitable that that three-legged stool would come together and that Western democracies would exist?
Well, actually, I think that's one of the big underlying points of these two books that I've written, is that it wasn't inevitable and that it actually proceeded from a certain kind of historical accident. So, for example, the origins of parliamentary government lie in the fact that there was one country in Europe, England, in which the fight between the king representing the state and the parliament representing the forces of accountability were fairly evenly balanced. They fought a civil war, they beheaded one king and they deposed another, and the result was a constitutional settlement that's really the basis for modern parliamentary constitutional government today. And that didn't happen in France, it didn't happen in Spain, it didn't happen in Russia, simply because the historical circumstances were different. So I do think that there is a fair amount of luck and accident in human history, which means that none of these political forms is necessarily inevitable.
So that's the explanation as to why some countries do develop these democratic, liberal democratic institutions and others don't. I mean, some of it's luck and some of it's what else?
Well, I don't think it's purely luck, because the formula of a balanced state that had a strong state but was also constrained, especially by law that protected things like property rights, turned out to be a tremendous platform for capitalist economic development. And so first England and then the United States, that had systems built around these kinds of political institutions, took off. They were the first to industrialize. And a lot of other countries looked at this and saw that if they wanted to get rich as well, they would have to protect property rights, they would have to ensure a certain substantial degree of individual freedom. And that's why the world has gone from about 35 democracies back in 1970 to something like 100, 115 in 2015. And so the model may be accidental when it starts out, but I think that people emulate success and they want to copy things that look like they're successful. So it's not a completely random series of events.
Understood. I guess the first time I met you on television, as it were, was back in 1989. We did an interview about your very famous essay, The End of History, in which you argue that liberal democracy sort of represents the highest and best form of organizing society. And I wonder whether the arguments you've now put forward and your analysis of the decay that we are now experiencing in Western democracies has changed your thinking about whether or not we are, in fact, still the best.
Well, I think normatively, I absolutely believe that. And I think in the long run, societies that really want to be modern and prosperous and stable need this combination of state, law, and accountability. But I guess where I've changed my views in the 25 years since I wrote that, The End of History, first, I appreciate much better how difficult it is to create modern institutions, and particularly modern state institutions, impersonal bureaucratic states. And then I would say that the theme of political decay is one that I had not been particularly aware of or thought much about 25 years ago. But I think that reflects developments that have happened since then, because I do think that the American system, doesn't look as attractive today as it did 25 years ago, although I think it still has some very important strengths.
Well, let's give a concrete example here of a society that you do think is very attractive and perhaps ought to be emulated, and that was Denmark. You talk about Denmark as being sort of the good society of the world today, and I wonder whether you think sort of small, ethnically homogeneous societies in the Northern Hemisphere are the best examples for other countries around the world to follow.
Well, Denmark is just a symbol for a country that is well governed, and probably the most important thing about it is that it has vanishingly low levels of political corruption. Corruption is one of those deficiencies in modern government that is probably the most pervasive, and it's also probably the one that's hardest to eradicate. And so I think, yes, Denmark is exceptional in the sense that it's very small. It up till now has been relatively homogeneous. It too is the product of a number of historical accidents, and so it's not something that can be easily emulated. But I think as a target or as an ideal type, that's why I talk about it.
Somebody who reviewed your book raised the following question. What if large sections of humanity don't much care about getting to Denmark? What's your answer for that?
Well, I think it's clear that there are important parts of the world that don't care about getting to Denmark. I think that development, however, is something, the desire for democracy obviously didn't exist in all periods of human history. It's only a couple hundred years old in the places where it's gotten established. But I think that it's something that appears over time as a result of economic and social growth. When you have a broader middle class that's well educated, that is connected with the outside world, they own property that can be taken away by the state. I think there's a universal demand for greater political participation, and you can see this really going on in many countries around the world. It's not a guarantee that democracy will appear, but I do think that it's not culturally determined. And you've seen this in quite a lot of very culturally different parts of the world.
Okay, Professor Fukuyama, we're going to continue our exploration of how democracies function or not, and why it is that in some parts of the world, words such as democracy and freedom conjure up images of chaos, decadence, and disarray. So, joining us now in Moscow, Russia, via Skype, here's Alexander Dugin. He's a Russian philosopher and political activist. His most recent book is called Eurasian Mission, an introduction to Neo-Eurasianism. And joining us in Klagenfurt, Austria, via Skype, there's Ivan Krastev, chairman of the Center for Liberal Strategies in Sofia, Bulgaria. He's a permanent fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna, Austria, and his most recent book is called Democracy Disrupted: The Politics of Global Protest. And we welcome our two other gentlemen to our program tonight. Ivan Krastev, I'd like to start with you. Do you recognize in the protests that you have studied for your own work elements of the institutional kind of decay that Professor Fukuyama is describing in his new book?
Yes, I'll agree, because I do believe one of the most important things about democracy and any political regime, this is the capacity of self-correction. You cannot expect that political regimes are always going to develop upwards. They're always going to be crises, they're going to be decline. But the basic problem is, do you have a capacity to learn from your mistakes? And I do believe one of the interesting stories which we see today, and I do believe it has a lot to do with the problem of governing these days, is that never in the world before it was so easy to get power and to lose power, but it is so difficult to govern. And part of the protest that we saw in the last 5 years, and by the way, in the last 5 years, in more than 70 countries in the world, both democracies and non-democracies, we have these very powerful popular protest movements, most of them not being organized by political parties or by trade unions. And what is important about these movements was very strong anti-institutional ethos. These people are not interested to be power. In a certain way, for them, the most important was to be critics of power. And I do believe this has something to do with the problem of difficulty of state building and governing, which Professor Fukuyama was talking about.
Okay. Alexander Dugin, as we welcome you into this conversation now, I wonder if we could start by having you tell us what your perception at the moment is of Western democracies as described by our other two guests.
My vision is much more critical than previous guests. because I think that we are dealing now not with technical, but philosophical or metaphysical problem. So the problem of the crisis of democracy lays, as long as I see, in the incapacity of the West, of the Western civilization to understand the positive other. The West is dealing only with negative vision of other. Other or is the same as ourself or is the lesser. So it is based on kind of messianic conception of universalism of Western civilization, where the West has constructed liberal democracy that maybe fits to the Western culture, Western history, maybe not. It's up to Western citizens to judge up to which point this is suitable for them. But all that is based on the absolutely racist premise about universalism of the Western system of values. So democracy we are dealing with is Western democracy that conceives all humanity to be a kind of imitation of the same or less than Western type. But we are dealing with different cultures, with different humanities. There is not only one humanity of the type of Western civilization. We have different cultures and different civilizations in plural and different humanities. There are many positive aspects in the West, but the one thing that everybody in the world, except maybe the West itself, hates, it is the way of imposing the values as something universal. So I think that this time it is a kind of lesson to teach to the West, to the Western civilization, that there can exist, that there can be positive other that shouldn't be judged by the Western patterns and should be acknowledged as something other that doesn't is the same or lesser or worse than the Western culture, but it's simply different. The Western democracy has its own place in the history of England, of United States of America, in the history of Western Europe. But it is regional, a local phenomenon, historically and geographically.
Francis Fukuyama, I suspect there are many in the West who would plead guilty to feeling that we have the best system of government and organizing society in the history of the world. But I'm not sure I've ever heard the word racist used in the past to describe it. And I wonder what you think of Alexander Dugin's use of that word to describe perhaps a Western sense of arrogance that we're doing it better than everybody else.
Well, I think Mr. Dugin is right. Historically, there was, a racist component to especially the imperial policies of many European powers, but I think it's ridiculous to say that that's somehow the essence of modern liberal democracy. The essence of liberalism is tolerance. Liberalism grew out of the religious wars in Europe in the 16th, 17th century. They were very bloody, and there's a recognition that if you have a society that's divided, at that time it was a religious divide, but it could be a racial divide, it could be an ethnic divide. There are many ways that societies are fractured, that the only real solution to this was a society in which people put aside these contestations over ultimate ends and agreed to live under a framework of law. And that's why I think liberal democracy really is universal, because in some sense, nobody lives in a homogeneous, society with one culture, not the Chinese, not the Russians, not anybody. I mean, there's a diversity of people that live in these places. They have to be governed in a way that they can mutually coexist. And so I think liberal democracy was actually a functional adaptation to the need to deal with diversity. And in fact, I think liberal societies are the ones that have dealt with the problem of race and ethnic division the most successfully, precisely because their core value is tolerance.
Ivan Krastev, where do you come down on this?
Also, my feeling is that basically Mr. Dugin's claim is that universalism means simply that Western institutions should be imposed on others. And here I agree, there is no one model, and nobody can simply impose his model. But if we are not going to agree that there is universal human values, this is very difficult for us to treat each other as equal human beings. I do believe it is universalism that makes us equal. And from this point of view, of course, democracy can come from different sources, and Indian democracy is based on a totally different experience and on totally different practices and even institutions than the American one. But it does not mean that liberalism should basically refuse to be universalist in order to fit this new reality. I do believe we're much more going to renegotiate what universalism means. Because if we're going to agree that we're simply different, that we're different civilizations and so on, several interesting questions come up. For example, there are people in Russia that believe that they're part of the European civilization, that others who believe that they're part of the Eurasian civilization. How we're going to solve this? How we're going to, this is the same everywhere. How we're going to solve basically the pluralistic nature of our own societies. And from this point of view, I don't believe that criticism against the universal nature of democracy as such can be equal to basically the idea of promoting democracy and so on. And some of these practices, of course, can be very legitimately criticized.
So let me ask Alexander Dugin to respond by asking what is it about liberal democratic ideas as practiced in the West that you find incompatible with Russian culture and history?
The most essential thing was said now by Mr. Fukuyama. He thinks, as well as many of liberals, any liberal, that human nature is the same, that human nature transcends cultures, and that is the problem of anthropology. The Western anthropology, and above all, Anglo-Saxon anthropology, is based on the concept of the human being as individual, as a positive individual with fully autonomous or partly autonomous content. But Russian anthropology, or Islamic anthropology, or Indian anthropology, or Chinese anthropology are absolutely different. For us Russians, the human, to be human, it is the same as to belong to the whole as some integrality, to some, for us, the man is not only individual, but is a kind of collectivity. For example, coming into modernity, Russia preferred communism and not liberalism, precisely because that we understand human nature differently. That is kind of holistic vision. So now we are not anymore communist. We are not Tsarist regime, but we are the same. We are Russians as always. We have been. So we are anthropologically holistic.
Let me follow up on that because my understanding of human nature is people want a job, a friend, a home. They want to be part of a family. Is that not what Russian people want?
Because you are Canadian, because you are part of Western, Anglo-Saxon, or Western European civilization, your measure is individual one, to have good job, good friends, good family, liberty or freedom or justice, and so on. But for us, Russian, there is something other that really is much more important, is the inner sense of belonging to the just system of the world, to the world harmony. This harmony is not only spiritual, it is also social, cultural, political, and for us it is very important also the other understood as a part of the whole, not only a particular and isolated human being aside. So it is completely different ontological and anthropological basis for our society. And we are Russians, we have friends, we are bothering about good job and work. But for us, there is something that is much more important. Before, it was conceived in the sense of religion, in the sense of loyalty to the Orthodox Church. After that, that was communism. And now, we are calling that Eurasian civilization. So it is a kind of feeling to belong to something that transcends our individuality, and that is much more important than it. That is our answer, historical experience and system of values defended by our writers, by Dostoevsky, by Tolstoy, every serious figure in our culture, in our literature, in our art, all of them were in one or other form defenders of this particularity of Russian cultures and expressed this in different manners.
Okay, let me get Francis Fukuyama to react to that. Perhaps we're all very different because human nature is not the same. Is he right about that?
Well, first of all, Mr. Dugin is not talking about different anthropologies. I mean, if there's a human nature, it's universal. That's the definition of human nature. It's a biologically given thing. What he's basically saying is that Russians are culturally different. Their culture is not as individualistic as Western culture. That is true historically, but it also assumes that cultures are these unchanging, monolithic entities that somehow are transmitted across generations and never change. I mean, there was a time when Western societies were far less individualistic. People were loyal to tribes at one point, and then they became loyal to larger collective units. And individualism is something that evolved, I think, in part out of the necessity of running a modern capitalist society, which in a market economy, in a sense, needs a greater degree of mobility, social mobility. And if you're tied down by kinship ties or by ties in which the state dictates the kind of occupation you can work in, a modern economy is not going to work. And so, in a way, individualism was a response to the functional needs of a society. Russia is no different.
I'm intrigued as to where Ivan Krastev comes down on this issue because as a Bulgarian, I think you share the Cyrillic alphabet that Russia has, and you also share the Eastern Orthodox Church that Russia has. So where are you on this?
We not only share, we basically invented the alphabet. No, I do believe this is the major issue. I will agree very much with Mr. Dugin that culture matters, that people are shaped by their experiences and by their historical experiences, but he's talking about this type of a cultural identity as if it is not contested within its own society. He named Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, but if you can name Pushkin and Herzen, you're going to see that what it means to be Russian was a question that had been very differently answered within Russian society. And he told you that you talk what you are talking because you're Canadian. But listen, there are not many Canadians 300 years ago. Probably you're coming from somewhere. And for example, all these Russians who are living now in different parts of the world, are they a part of this same communitarian culture? Or to what extent they're more individualistic? So I'm going to agree with Francis Fukuyama on the fact that cultures change. And by the way, cultures change by institutions, by the level of economic developments, they change by what's happening to them. As a result of it, of course, Russia's idea of good society is going to be different probably than the idea of the good society of the United States. But it does not mean that when a Russian dies or Bulgarian dies and somebody is going to have an autopsy, we are going to find a different biological being.
Mr. Dugin, let me get you to follow up with this then. If the Russian people were raised, rather than on the values that you have ascribed so far in our program, but rather following liberal values like universal human rights and gender equality and minority rights, how would Russia be different?
We could choose freely without imposition or hegemony of the West. I am absolutely sure that we would choose some development and change basing on our proper cultural identity. So we are changing, but not necessarily in the sense of the Western civilization.
Okay.
There is very good term proposed by Huntington, modernization without westernization. That is, it is our case. We are going into the future. We are not obliged to be always in the past. But our future is different. It is a Russian future based on Russian values and
No,
not
I understand
imposed.
that. I understand, but I'm wondering what would be different about Russia, or what would Russia lose if, rather than the values Russians are raised on today, they were raised on values of minority rights, gender equality, universal human rights, etc.
Because that all contradicts to our values. For us, family is something sacred. The relations between man and woman are not only natural, but spiritually and culturally founded. So the idea of the egoism, positive or enlightened or other, are completely rejected by our society.
Francis Fukuyama, it doesn't sound to me like Alexander Dugin wants to be like Denmark. What do you have to say to him about that?
Well, it's interesting, you know. Actually, as far as I can tell, the main thing that he's got against contemporary Western liberalism is gay marriage.
Well, that's part of it, to be sure.
Which has been kind of at the forefront of the liberal agenda. But I wouldn't be as sure as him that Russians will never accept something like that, because you just look at the West. You know, 15, 20 years ago, nobody accepted gay marriage. It was, you know, not talked about, and it was swept under the table. And there's just been this unbelievable shift in popular opinion, and especially if you look by age, people under the age of 30 have absolutely no objection to it, whereas there's a lot of resistance in older generations. And, you know, I wouldn't be surprised if Russia went through a similar kind of transformation, that the state might try to slow down or stop, but it's something that happens spontaneously. So I just think that, you know, these confident assertions that Russian culture is always this and it will always oppose a certain thing, just don't have a basis in empirical fact.
Gentlemen, we've been chatting for quite a good pace of time so far, and somehow we have not yet mentioned the word Ukraine. But we will now, because this is a part of the world that we must discuss. Alexander Dugin, tell us, what does Vladimir Putin want?
So, Vladimir Putin wanted to have Ukraine as a neutral country governed by democracy in the old sense. Democracy as the rule of majority. I understand that liberal democracy, it is the rule of minority against the majority. And in front of the fear to be persecuted by majority, a minority begins to persecute majority. It is liberal understanding of liberal democracy. And that is precisely what has happened in Ukraine. Russia, that is culturally and historically very close to this part of southern and eastern Ukraine, came to help them to affirm their rights to say no to this dictatorship. And that was the essence of the conflict and the essence of the reunification with Crimea and the revolt in Donbass. And I think that now we could not wait natural or easy solution for that. So that was reason, as Russians understand the situation, and I think that we are on the edge of the real, maybe global conflict, because Russia cannot accept what has happened in the Kiev.
Let me ask a follow-up on that if I can. Why cannot Russia accept a Ukraine that's not neutral?
Because half of the population in the Ukraine is pro-Russian, and the government of Ukraine is anti-Russian. That has come to the power with the help of the West. So that is great reaction inside of Russia and inside of eastern and southern Ukraine against such situation. So Russia could be the only possibility to satisfy this situation from our point of view is creating in Ukraine two countries democratically with, for example, eastern part governed by democracy as a rule of majority, and the western part ruled by western kind of liberal democracy.
Could the western part of Ukraine, could the western part of Ukraine be part of NATO?
That will be against historical tradition of this part of the Ukraine, but in the present situation, I fear it is inevitable.
Okay, let me go to Ivan Krastev. We in the West really want to better understand where Russia is coming from on this issue. And could you tell us what you think Western Europeans and North Americans don't understand about how Russia thinks about this issue as it manifests itself in Ukraine?
No, I do believe one of the things where I do believe that West was wrong and naive is, especially European Union, never perceived itself as a threat. We believe that we are so nice and vegetarian that basically we cannot threaten anybody. So from this point of view, this was wrong. And also, Russians does not share Europeans' view that the end of the Cold War was a win-win situation. Many Russians, and here Mr. Putin speaks for the majority of the Russians, basically believes that Russia was the loser and basically it was mistreated in the post-Cold War period. If Mr. Dugin believes that the majority has the right, this is true for the Hungarian majority, this is true for the Ukrainian majority too. And the biggest, at least my reading of the conflict is it didn't start as a geopolitical clash between Russia and the European Union. People that have been on the streets, not the first 5 or 10 days, but later, there were much more reaction to the Yanukovych government and to the fact that force was used, and basically to the corruption of the Ukrainian political elite, which cannot be confined only to Yanukovych. But the basic problem was that then, I do believe that Russia, with the annexation of Crimea, totally humiliated the Ukrainian nation. And what I saw, and for me this is a very important division, many in the West talk about Ukraine as if being divided between the Russian speakers and the Ukrainian speakers. I don't believe that this is the major divide these days. You're going to see these days, in my view, I find this as a tragic development. Many Russian speakers who do not speak Ukrainian and being very strongly Ukrainian nationalists because they are defending the identity of their state. And from this point of view, the problem is that either they're going to be the Ukraine, which is going to be tolerant to the minority, and this Donbass and so on, and I do believe here basically we all are going to agree, or in a certain way, they're going to be somebody outside telling to the Ukrainians, listen, you cannot be anti-Russian, pro-Western, because this is not part of your anthropology. But it's an anthropology change. I was very kind of personally hurt to see how high the level of anti-Russian sentiments is in the Russian-speaking places like Kiev. But this has a lot to do with the way now Russia is treating the Ukrainian conflict. And this is going to be a very, very difficult development because I agree with Mr. Dugin that it's not simply Mr. Putin, that there is a very important Russian now support for what's happening in Donbass. But we can very end up with destabilized Ukraine, but also very much destabilized Russia. And this is not going to be good for anybody.
To use Ivan Krastev's words, Francis Fukuyama, we're not vegetarians in the West. We have a dog in this hunt. You pointed out earlier that when the West does engage in some areas geopolitically, it's often with tragic consequences and not well thought through. Do we need to, in your view, better understand where Russia's coming from on the issue of Ukraine?
Well, certainly. I actually would agree with what Ivan said and Mr. Dugin that the United States made a lot of mistakes in its policy towards Russia and towards that region in the lead up to this, but that does not justify Russia's actions. I guess I differ from Mr. Dugin in the following sense, that he would like to see this as a clash of equally principled ideologies. I think that the real issue in Ukraine and ultimately the real issue in Russia is not a different set of values, it's corruption. the whole Ukrainian elite was built, it was a kleptocracy. It was a regime that was in place to extract resources using state power for their own private benefit, and in many respects, that is exactly the same kind of system that Mr. Putin is running. They're both democratically elected, they have democratic legitimacy, but they are basically kleptocracies. And I think that what all the young protesters in Maidan Square were saying was, we don't want to live in that kind of country.
Alexander Dugin, let's broaden the discussion beyond Ukraine. I note that you are advancing an idea of a Eurasian Empire, which would include, beyond Russia, Austria, Hungary, Romania, Serbia, and Slovakia. Help us understand what the idea is there.
So never, that is a kind of accusation recently. So never I have written the words concerning necessity to include in a kind of Eurasian Empire the Eastern European countries. It is ridiculous. In all my writings, I have spoken about recreation a great space, not necessarily empire, not necessarily kind of unitarian state, but something like European Union, but on the alternative basis, civilizational basis. And these kind of the creation of Eurasian supranational organization or Eurasian Union, I always consider to be in the borders of the ancient Russian Empire or Soviet Union or less. So that should be a unification of the people and countries with the common historic experience, with common destiny, and based absolutely on the free will.
Okay, Ivan Krastev, do you think the West has anything to fear from a potential Eurasian empire that includes some of the countries that we just listed?
Listen, first, I do believe that Russia, like every other country, has the right of their integration project. So if they have a soft power and if they can attract state and societies to join them, welcome. So from this point of view, I don't have any problem with the Eurasian Union in the way it is now, or it could be, if this is based on a free choice and basically if societies go there. But the problem with this proposal is that at this moment, I cannot see what is the model on the base of which Russia is going to attract all these countries. I'm now staying in Austria, being Bulgarian and so on. And listen, I don't see any Austrian which is very much interested to join the Eurasian Union. You can say that basically Russia now looks as a great power, but Russia is very much one person. When you talk about institutions that basically Mr. Fukuyama started his talk about, strangely enough, Mr. Putin is not creating any institutions. Neither the United Russia, even the presidency basically, is not an institution that you can easily imagine after Putin. So from this point of view, till now, the major soft power coming from Russia is cheap resources. You can see Mr. Orban bargaining that he's going to get 10 billion from Gazprom for this or that. You can see different Western politicians being very much interested in this, but I don't believe this is the soft power on the base of which you can create a Eurasian Union, which is going to be something more than basically business deals there. So from this point of view, I do believe European Union has its own problems, but I don't see the promise of the Eurasian Union as the thing that is going to destabilize it.
Francis Fukuyama, am I right in saying that you were once a student of Samuel Huntington's?
That's right, I was.
You were. Okay, so we actually had him on this program once upon a time talking about his clash of civilizations, which of course has been the subject of so much conversation. And I wonder whether you think that clash of civilizations is happening between Russia and Ukraine right now.
Well, you know, I was a student and owe a lot to Sam Huntington. I didn't like that book. I wrote a critical review of it in the Wall Street Journal, and we had a slightly tense moment in our relationship after that. But it's for the exact same reason that I disagree with Mr. Dugin, that, yeah, there are cultural differences. They can be very deep and abiding, but they're also integrative forces that operate in the world, and therefore, you know, and societies are divided and cultures change, and so therefore, it does seem to me that there is a basis for things like universal values to exist. There are parts of the world where it's more applicable. So the only part of the world that really thinks of itself as a civilization is the Middle East, where there's a concept of a Muslim ummah. The idea that Ukraine and Russia are somehow part of separate civilizations is, well, in fact, I suspect Mr. Dugin's argument is they're part of the same civilization and that it's basically a Russian one. But both of these societies are divided internally. They're divided in terms of values and the kinds of institutions that people prefer. And so I think it's completely unhelpful to see that conflict in cultural terms. It's really a combination of internal politics exacerbated by a lot of external interference right now.
Okay, let me put the question somewhat differently then. Do we Western Democrats love our way of organizing society and our democracy so much that we're prepared to do clearly more than we have already done, which many would argue is not very much at all, in order to try to get Ukraine to be part of us?
Well, I think, yes, there's a moral obligation to support people that want to be self-determining, but there's also a larger principle at stake. The post-1991 European settlement was based on the idea that Russians that are stranded outside of Russia would stay in place and that everybody would figure out how to live peacefully in that kind of a situation. And Mr. Putin has thrown that principle out the window. He's basically told all these Russian populations, if you're unhappy, we're going to come to your support, and that is going to destabilize many countries well beyond Ukraine.
Ivan Krastev, how do you see it?
Listen, I basically see what's happening there very much as Russia's revolt against globalization. And I do believe that after 25 years of development, basically Russia does not see this type of economic results that it was expecting from this transition. And I very much agree that comparing Russia with China, basically, you can see that China was doing much better. So from this point of view, I'm going to try to read current Russian policy much more as aggressive isolationism than a classical imperial policy. Because the problem with the European order after 1989, and from this point of view, European order was different than the global order, was that we're not going to change borders. We're not going to exchange populations like after the World War II in order to secure borders, but we're going to change the nature of the borders. And I do believe that as a result of this, what we see is that Mr. Putin is not simply changing the borders with Crimea, but he's much more changing the nature of the border between Russia and the West. In economic terms, it's very much going back to kind of a self-sufficient economy, if this is possible. Also, the way you have the movement of people and ideas, this idea of the nationalization of the elites, I don't believe that Russia is going to gain much out of it. I agree very much that we cannot talk about civilizational wars between Ukraine and Russia. This is ridiculous in a way. But I do believe that you have two countries with a very difficult identity issues. Both in Ukraine and Russia, there was a very painful process of identity building after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And unfortunately, basically, now this type of a difficult identity building ended up in the war, which in my view is not going to benefit any other. But my principal position is that the West should not be interested in containing or isolating Russia. So from this point of view, strangely enough, I do believe some of the hoax in the West and Mr. Putin, basically they agree on something. They totally want to make the border between Russia and the West as a kind of a wall. This time, the wall is not going to be built by the Russians. It's going to be built by the Ukrainians. And I don't like it, because in a certain way, what started with 1989 was not simply building new walls. The idea was to ruin the walls.
Gentlemen, we have just a few minutes left, and I'd like to raise one more issue. And Alexander Dugin, I'll start with you on this. As we see Western countries putting increasing sanctions on Russia because of Ukraine, we are reminded of many things, but certainly one thing above all, and that is the great capacity of the Russian people to suffer. We know well in the West of the incredible amount of suffering that the Russian people endured during World War II. And I would just like to ask Mr. Dugin to help us understand where this great capacity for suffering comes from.
So, from the point of view of the liberal anthropology, expressed, for example, in Jeremiah Bentham, the human being naturally avoids suffering. But it is maybe Anglo-Saxon human being avoids necessary suffering. But in the Christian culture, in Russian culture, Russian people is very deeply Christian. Suffering is a kind of the way of the salvation of the soul. So for us, suffering for the right cause is a kind of the dignity and the form of to accept human destiny, because the life is suffering. So for us, sanctions against us only consolidate our society, because we feel that we are suffering not for the stupidity or weakness of our president or our government, but we are suffering for defending right cause against any temptation to impose on us some foreign will, some set of values that we refuse. So for us, it is a kind of sacred suffering. And I think that sanctions help to our society to come to return to our sources. I see these sanctions very positively, because they help to us to rely upon our proper resources, upon our proper forces, to evaluate better our identity. And I agree with Mr. Krastev concerning the fragility of the Putin's rule in the absence of the institutions. So it is very, very dangerous to Putin to play this game he is now playing without institutional reforms. It is very true. But I think that he is obliged to create some institutions in order to confirm this course that he has resolutely taken, chosen, in order to affirm Russian sovereignty against this kind of imposition of foreign will that was in Ukraine.
Let me get Ivan Krastev to respond to that by asking whether you think Vladimir Putin is counting on all of what Alexander Dugin just said in order to get through this crisis.
No, I do believe that especially on short term, this consolidation effect is there. But what the Russian population so much liked about the annexation of Crimea was that Crimea was annexed and there was no human victims. Nobody died for this. I do believe that with the passing of time, and this is interesting to see, to what extent the Russian population is going to agree to pay the bill for this policy, especially, and here I do believe Mr. Dugin is going to agree with me, if they see that the Russian elites are as corrupt as they used to be before. So they ask from the people to sacrifice, and you know now Prime Minister Medvedev said that medicines are going 20% up. For people, it matters. When you see this type of a corrupt elites which are telling the people you should suffer in the name of the Russia's glory, I do believe that this is not a recipe for a long-term consolidation. And from this point of view, I also very much agree with the problem of the institutions. I do believe that Mr. Putin for sure is a strong leader. He showed his capacity to take risks and to stay on certain positions, but he was not for the moment managed to be an institution builder, which makes him very different than other people in history that he probably compare himself with. So this combination between weak institution and the corrupt elites, I don't believe that in the long run, the sanctions are going to have such a positive role for the Russian identity as Mr. Dugin believes.
Francis Fukuyama, let me give you the last word on this.
It's really important for the West to actually support the Russian people. Russia is not Vladimir Putin. Russia is a much more complicated society, and it's not clear, given the personal basis of his rule, what kind of society is going to come after he's gone from the scene. And therefore, it does seem to me that it's probably important to build bridges perhaps not with this elite necessarily, but with ordinary people that are actually going to be the ones that will continue to live and, suffer and exist under the political conditions that Putin has created.
Gentlemen, I can't thank you enough for spending so much time with us here on TVO tonight. It was really a marvelous discussion. Our thanks go out to Alexander Dugin, the Russian philosopher and political activist. His latest is called Eurasian Mission, An Introduction to Neo-Eurasianism. Ivan Krastev, the chairman of the Center for the Liberal Strategies in Sofia, permanent fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna. Democracy Disrupted, the Politics of Global Protest is his latest. And Francis Fukuyama, the senior fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies at Stanford, Political Order and Political Decay is his latest. Gentlemen, a great pleasure having you on TVO tonight. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.